moment police confirmed the arrest, the narrative around Melodee Buzzard's disappearance did not become clearer. It fractured. A body had been found. A name had been placed in handcuffs. And yet, the most disturbing questions had only just begun. Because an arrest does not always mean resolution, and a discovery does not always explain what truly happened. This video, Ashlee Buzzard arrested after Melodee Buzzard's body found, begins the exact point where most official statements stop. After the headline, after the press release, after the certainty is implied but not proven. What unfolded next was not a clean sequence of facts, but a collision of timelines, behaviors, and unanswered gaps that refuse to sit quietly inside a single explanation. If investigators believe they know who is responsible, why does so much of surrounding evidence still feel unresolved? If this case is moving forward, why do critical moments leading up to the discovery raise more doubts than answers? And if the truth is already settled, why does the timeline itself appear to resist it? Picture the moment the body was located, not as closure, but as a turning point, a scene that should have narrowed the story, instead widened it. Details emerged slowly. Some were confirmed, others were conspicuously absent, and with every update, the distance between what was officially stated and what could be independently verified began to grow. This case is not just about an arrest. It is about what preceded it. The decisions made before law enforcement intervened. The silences that followed key events. The small, easily overlooked inconsistencies that often matter the most in serious investigations. What was known early, what was assumed, and what, according to public records, may not have been examined with the scrutiny it deserved. As this documentary unfolds, the focus is not on speculation or sensational claims. It is on sequence, on documented actions, on the difference between what is said and what can be shown. Because when a case reaches this stage, the most important question is no longer who was arrested. It is whether the full story has actually been told. And once you see how the pieces line up or fail to, this case may not look the way it did when the breaking news first appeared. The investigation reached a decisive procedural stage when law enforcement confirmed the human remains recovered in Utah had been formally identified as those of Melodee Buzzard, a 9-year-old child who had been reported missing weeks earlier from California. The identification followed forensic testing conducted on remains located in early December, in an area authorities stated had been traveled to by the child and her mother during a documented road trip. According to public reporting, investigators had delayed any formal announcement until laboratory confirmation could be obtained, citing the condition of the remains and the necessity of scientific verification before attribution could be made. Investigators acknowledged a critical procedural reality. The discovery did not immediately resolve questions surrounding cause, timing, or manner of death. The identification served as confirmation of identity only, not as a comprehensive forensic conclusion. Authorities emphasized that the evidentiary threshold at this stage was limited to biological attribution, with further analysis required to establish additional findings. Public reporting indicated that the identification was made through DNA testing after investigators waited for laboratory results to return. Law enforcement sources told ABC News that the samples ultimately confirmed the remains belonged to Melodee Buzzard. Officials stated that the remains were consistent with those of a child of her age, though they cautioned that the condition of the remains necessitated careful handling of any preliminary conclusions. At this stage of the investigation, no public documentation detailed whether the DNA sample yielded a full profile or partial markers, nor whether environmental degradation had affected the evidentiary quality of the material recovered. Investigators introduced a further clarification that shifted the procedural posture of the case. Law enforcement sources stated that they believe Melodee Buzzard had likely been deceased since October, based on investigative timelines rather than completed forensic dating. This assessment was described as an investigative belief rather than a definitive scientific conclusion, pending further forensic analysis. Officials did not publicly specify whether entomological data, environmental indicators, or other post-mortem interval methodologies had been applied. As additional context emerged, authorities linked the Utah recovery site to a previously documented road trip taken by the child and her mother, Ashlee Buzzard, beginning on October 7th. Investigators stated that this geographical overlap formed part of the rationale for prioritizing DNA testing on the recovered remains. The confirmation of identity, according to law enforcement sources, directly preceded subsequent enforcement actions taken in the case. The confirmation introduced a new procedural tension. While identity had been established, the investigation remained dependent on incomplete scientific findings. Officials acknowledged that forensic determinations regarding cause of death, mechanism of injury, and precise time of death had not yet been publicly finalized. Any conclusions beyond identity, they stated, would require additional examination and corroboration. The identification also prompted renewed examination of earlier investigative steps. Authorities reiterated that Melodee Buzzard had been reported missing after her school documented an extended absence, which triggered a welfare inquiry in October. That report, rather than an immediate family notification, marked the formal beginning of the missing child investigation. Law enforcement noted that this chronology remained relevant as investigators reconstructed events preceding the Utah discovery. Officials emphasized that the identification remains represented a threshold moment rather than an endpoint. The confirmation resolved one question, while formalizing several others. Investigators stated that they were continuing to evaluate physical evidence, travel records, and prior statements in light of the identification, with particular attention to the period following October 7. No public statement at this stage addressed whether trauma could be conclusively identified from the remains. Authorities used cautious language, noting that certain determinations could be inconclusive depending on preservation and environmental exposure. Investigators declined to speculate publicly, reiterating that scientific review was ongoing. By the conclusion of this phase, the case had shifted from a missing child investigation to a death investigation with an identified victim. While identity had been established through forensic means, the broader evidentiary record remained incomplete. Officials acknowledged that further results were pending, and that definitive conclusions would require additional time, review, and corroboration before the full circumstances surrounding Melodee Buzzard's death could be formally articulated. The investigation advanced into an enforcement phase when authorities confirmed the arrest of Ashlee Buzzard following the forensic identification of human remains recovered in Utah. Law enforcement sources stated that the arrest occurred after DNA results established that the remains belonged to Melodee Buzzard, the 9-year-old child previously reported missing from California. Officials described the arrest as procedurally tied to the confirmation of identity, rather than to newly disclosed forensic conclusions regarding cause or mechanism of death. At this stage, authorities emphasized that the arrest reflected a threshold determination based on accumulated investigative findings rather than a final evidentiary resolution. Within the initial disclosure surrounding the arrest, investigators clarified that the timing of enforcement action had been contingent on laboratory confirmation. For several weeks, law enforcement had publicly acknowledged that remains had been recovered but refrained from attribution while awaiting DNA analysis. The return of results, according to public reporting, directly preceded the decision to take Ashlee Buzzard into custody. Officials stated that the arrest was executed at her residence and described it as the next procedural step following confirmation of identity. As the announcement continued, authorities noted that the arrest did not coincide with the release of a charging document detailing specific factual allegations. Law enforcement sources characterized the action as based on probable cause developed through the broader investigation, including travel timelines, witness statements, and the circumstances surrounding the child's disappearance. Investigators cautioned that additional details would be addressed through formal court proceedings rather than through public briefings. The arrest also prompted renewed scrutiny of Ashlee Buzzard's prior interactions with investigators. Public reporting indicated that law enforcement had previously described her as uncooperative during portions of the missing child investigation. Officials did not specify whether this characterization contributed directly to the arrest decision, but they acknowledged that cooperation levels are routinely evaluated when assessing investigative credibility and consistency. In contextualizing the arrest, authorities reference a separate legal matter involving Ashlee Buzzard that had occurred weeks earlier. In November, she had been charged with false imprisonment after allegedly preventing a man from leaving her home during efforts related to the search for Melodee Buzzard. That charge was later dismissed, and she was released. Investigators stated that the earlier case was legally distinct from the death investigation, and that its dismissal did not preclude subsequent enforcement action based on new or corroborated evidence. As the narrative progressed, Law enforcement sources emphasize that the arrest should not be interpreted as a conclusion regarding guilt or final responsibility. Officials reiterated standard legal cautions, noting that an arrest represents an allegation subject to judicial review and evidentiary testing. No conviction had been secured, and no trial proceedings had yet commenced at the time of the announcement. Authorities further stated that the arrest followed an extended period of investigative review, during which multiple agencies coordinated efforts across jurisdictions. Because the remains were located in Utah while the disappearance originated in California, investigators had worked across state lines to consolidate findings. Law enforcement acknowledged that such coordination can affect the timing of enforcement actions, particularly when forensic confirmation is pending. By the end of this phase, the case had entered a new procedural posture, with the victim formally identified and the mother arrested. The investigation transitioned from a missing child inquiry into a criminal case subject to prosecutorial standards. Officials indicated that additional information would be released through court filings rather than media statements. Despite the arrest, authorities maintained that several aspects of the case, including forensic conclusions and precise timelines, remained under active review and had not yet been fully resolved. The formal investigation into the whereabouts of Melodee Buzzard began not with an emergency call from a family member, but through a mandatory reporting mechanism initiated by her school. According to public reporting, school officials documented an extended and unexplained absence and notified authorities in October after Melodee failed to appear for multiple consecutive days. This notification triggered a welfare inquiry consistent with state protocols governing prolonged absences of minor children, particularly when no verified explanation has been provided by a legal guardian. Law enforcement records indicated that, at the time the report was made, Melodee Buzzard was 9 years old and resided in California with her mother, Ashlee Buzzard. Authorities noted that no prior missing person report had been filed by the family before the school's intervention. Investigators later stated that the absence report marked the first documented point at which Melodee's location became an official matter of concern, establishing a fixed starting point for the investigative timeline. Upon receipt of the school's report, authorities initiated preliminary checks to verify whether the absence had an administrative explanation, such as a school transfer, illness documentation, or approved travel. According to officials, no corroborating records were produced during these initial inquiries. As a result, the case escalated from an attendance matter to a welfare investigation, and law enforcement began attempts to contact Ashlee Buzzard directly. Investigators stated that early communications with the mother did not yield immediate verification of Melodee's location. Law enforcement did not publicly release detailed transcripts of these interactions, but acknowledged that responses provided during this phase did not resolve the child's status to the satisfaction of authorities. As a result, the case was formally classified as a missing child investigation. At this stage, investigators began reconstructing the child's last known movements using available records. Authorities confirmed that Melodee had not been physically seen at school since early October. No third-party confirmation was produced indicating her presence elsewhere during the period following her absence. Law enforcement emphasized that the absence of independent verification was a key factor in expanding the scope of the inquiry. The disappearance report also prompted coordination between school officials, child welfare agencies, and local law enforcement. Investigators noted that such cases require careful documentation to establish whether a child's absence is voluntary, custodial, or potentially criminal in nature. At the time of the initial report, authorities stated that no definitive classification could be made, as the available information was incomplete. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement determined that Melodee and her mother had left their California residence earlier in October. The disappearance report had established a foundation for all subsequent investigative actions. While it did not explain where Melodee Buzzard was or what had occurred, it created the first official record of concern, anchoring the timeline and obligating authorities to pursue further inquiry. Investigators later confirmed that every subsequent development in the case traced back to this initial report, which transformed an unexplained absence into a formal missing child investigation whose implications would later extend far beyond its original scope. Following the initiation of the missing child investigation, law enforcement shifted focus toward reconstructing the movements of Melodee Buzzard and her mother during the period immediately preceding the disappearance report, according to public reporting and official statements. Investigators determined that Melodee and Ashlee Buzzard departed their California residence on October 7th for what was described as a planned 3-day road trip. This determination was based on travel records, rental documentation, and surveillance footage obtained during the early phase of the inquiry. Authorities confirmed that the trip originated in California and was initially represented as extending eastward. Investigators stated that the intended destination was Nebraska, a detail later corroborated through travel documentation. Law enforcement emphasized that the duration and scope of the trip were relevant to the investigation because Melodee was not seen again in any verified setting after the departure date. As part of the timeline reconstruction, investigators obtained surveillance video from a car rental facility in the family's hometown. The footage, dated October 7th, depicted Ashlee Buzzard and Melodee together at the location while securing the rental vehicle. Authorities described the footage as the last confirmed visual record of Melodee in the presence of her mother. Law enforcement noted that Ashlee appeared to be wearing a wig in the video, though officials did not publicly ascribe motive or significance to that observation beyond documenting it as part of the evidentiary record. Following departure from California, investigators traced the route taken through a combination of rental car data, financial transactions, and location information. Law enforcement stated that the road trip included travel through multiple states, consistent with a route toward Nebraska. Authorities did not release a complete itinerary, but confirmed that the pair traveled through Colorado before entering the Utah region. According to investigators, Melodee Buzzard was last believed to have been seen alive on October 9th near the Colorado-Utah border. This determination was described as the last confirmed sighting based on available evidence. Officials did not specify whether the sighting was supported by eyewitness testimony, digital location data, or a combination of sources, citing the need to protect investigative integrity. The timeline further indicated that Ashlee Buzzard returned the rental vehicle at a later date without Melodee present. Law enforcement stated that the return of the vehicle constituted a significant chronological marker, as it established a point at which the child was no longer with her mother during a verified transaction. Investigators noted that no contemporaneous explanation was documented that accounted for Melodee's absence at that time. Authorities emphasized that the 3-day duration initially associated with the trip did not align cleanly with subsequent movements identified during the investigation. The discrepancy between the represented length of travel and the actual timeline reconstructed by investigators became an area of analytical focus. Law enforcement stated that inconsistencies in travel duration and location were evaluated alongside other evidence, but did not publicly disclose conclusions at this stage. Throughout this phase, investigators underscored the limitations of the reconstructed timeline. While certain points were supported by documentation or surveillance, other intervals remained unverified. Officials cautioned that gaps in travel records are not uncommon in multi-state investigations and do not, by themselves, establish intent or culpability. By the end of the timeline reconstruction phase, law enforcement had established a basic chronological framework. Departure on October 7th, last believed sighting near the Colorado-Utah border on October 9th, and return to California without the child. While this framework did not answer all questions, it provided investigators with structured sequence against which other evidence, including forensic findings and statements, could be evaluated as the case progressed. As investigators continued assembling the chronology of events surrounding Melodee Buzzard's disappearance, surveillance footage became a focal point of analytical review. Law enforcement confirmed that video obtained from a car rental facility in the family's hometown documented Ashlee Buzzard and her daughter together on October 7th, the day authorities determined they departed California. The footage, time-stamped and preserved as part of the evidentiary record, was described as clear enough to establish presence but limited in scope regarding context or intent. Investigators stated that the footage showed Ashlee Buzzard completing the rental transaction while Melodee remained nearby. Officials noted that Ashlee appeared to be wearing a wig at the time. This detail was documented in investigative summaries without an accompanying conclusion as to its relevance. Law enforcement emphasized that visual anomalies in surveillance footage are recorded as factual observations, not as determinations of deceptive conduct, unless corroborated by additional evidence. The surveillance video was identified as the last confirmed visual record of Melodee Buzzard in the presence of her mother. Authorities stated that no subsequent surveillance imagery had been recovered that conclusively placed Melodee at another verified location after October 7th. Investigators acknowledged that the absence of further video did not, by itself, establish what occurred afterward, but it did define the outer boundary of confirmed documentation. In reviewing the footage, analysts assessed not only who appeared on camera, but also the surrounding metadata, including timestamps, transaction records, and the location of the recording device. Law enforcement indicated that the video was consistent with rental documentation, showing a vehicle was secured that day. No irregularities were publicly identified in the transaction itself, and no third parties were confirmed to be present during the recorded interaction. Authorities also evaluated whether the footage aligned with subsequent statements provided during the investigation. While details of those statements were not released in full, investigators acknowledged that consistency between recorded evidence and later accounts is routinely examined. Officials declined to specify whether any discrepancies were identified, stating only that the footage formed one component of a larger evidentiary review. The appearance of a wig in the footage drew attention during public reporting, prompting law enforcement to clarify their position. Investigators stated that clothing or appearance choices captured on surveillance are not inherently indicative of criminal conduct. Such details are cataloged and assessed in context, particularly when reconstructing movements or verifying identity, but do not independently establish motive or wrongdoing. As part of the surveillance analysis, investigators also considered what the footage did not show. The video did not capture any indication of distress, coercion, or unusual interaction between mother and child. Law enforcement emphasized that surveillance footage often provides limited perspective and should not be interpreted beyond what is visibly documented. The absence of additional corroborating footage from later points in the trip presented analytical constraints. Authorities acknowledge that surveillance coverage diminishes significantly once individuals leave commercial or urban environments. As a result, investigators relied on other forms of documentation to bridge the gaps left by video evidence. The surveillance footage had assumed a defined evidentiary role. It confirmed presence, established timing, and marked the last verified visual sighting of Melodee Buzzard. At the same time, it raised questions that could not be answered through imagery alone. Investigators stated that the footage neither resolved nor disproved competing interpretations of subsequent events, leaving its ultimate significance dependent on how it aligned with travel data, witness accounts, and forensic findings still under review. As the investigation progressed beyond departure documentation and surveillance review, law enforcement identified a critical temporal marker, the last confirmed sighting of Melodee Buzzard. According to official statements cited in public reporting, investigators determined that Melodee was last believed to have been seen alive on October 9th, near the Colorado-Utah border. This assessment was presented as a final point at which authorities could place the child within a narrow geographic and chronological frame, supported by available evidence. Investigators clarified that the designation last confirmed sighting reflected the limits of corroborated information rather than a definitive endpoint of life. Law enforcement did not publicly disclose a precise evidentiary basis for this determination, citing investigative sensitivity. Officials acknowledge that such designations may rely on a combination of indirect indicators, including travel data, transactional records, and verified movements, rather than a single eyewitness account. At approximately this stage of the inquiry, authorities emphasized that no verified sightings of Melodee Buzzard were documented after October 9th. No surveillance footage, third-party confirmations, or institutional records were identified that placed her in another location following that date. Investigators noted that this absence of documentation did not establish what occurred, but constrained the window in which subsequent events must have taken place. The geographic reference to the Colorado-Utah border was described as significant due to its alignment with the reconstructed road trip route. Law enforcement stated that the area fell within the path investigators believed Ashlee Buzzard and Melodee traveled during the 3-day trip. Officials did not specify whether the sighting determination was tied to a specific location, stop, or interaction, and cautioned against interpreting the designation as evidence of a witness incident. As the timeline was refined, investigators assessed whether any contemporaneous records to corroborate Melodee's presence beyond October 9th. Authorities reported that no medical visits, school contacts, or digital communications were identified that involved the child after that date. Law enforcement emphasized that the lack of such record became increasingly relevant as the investigation shifted toward a narrower time frame. Officials also addressed the distinction between confirmed and reported sightings. Law enforcement noted that tips or unverified reports received after October 9th were evaluated, but did not meet the evidentiary standard required for confirmation. Investigators stated that such reports are common in missing child cases, but must be corroborated through independent means before being incorporated into the formal timeline. Authorities underscored the provisional nature of the October 9th designation. They reiterated that the date represented the last point supported by available evidence at the time, not a conclusive determination of when harm occurred. Officials indicated that forensic analysis of the recovered remains could later refine or challenge this assessment, depending on scientific findings. The absence of verified sightings following October 9th also informed subsequent investigative priorities. Law enforcement stated that efforts were directed toward examining movements and actions occurring immediately after that date, particularly those involving the return of the rental vehicle and Ashlee Buzzard's reappearance without her daughter. Investigators emphasized that the narrowing of the timeline was essential for evaluating consistency across records and statements. By the conclusion of this chapter of the investigation, the last confirmed sighting stood as a pivotal but limited data point. It marked the boundary of verified presence while leaving unresolved what transpired afterward. Authorities acknowledged that without direct observation or contemporaneous documentation beyond October 9th, conclusions regarding subsequent events remain dependent on inference, corroboration, and pending forensic results, all of which continue to shape the evolving investigative record. Following the determination of the last confirmed sighting near the Colorado-Utah border, investigators focused on a subsequent event that carried significant chronological weight: the return of the rental vehicle by Ashlee Buzzard without Melodee present. According to law enforcement statements referenced in public reporting, the vehicle rented on October 7th was returned at a later date, and Melodee Buzzard was not with her mother at the time of that transaction. Authorities identified this moment as a fixed, verifiable point in the timeline that required explanation. Investigators stated that the return of the vehicle constituted an objectively documented interaction, supported by rental records and facility procedures. Unlike other portions of the road trip that required reconstruction through indirect data, the vehicle return provided a concrete marker showing Ashlee Buzzard acting alone. Officials emphasized that the absence of the child during this verified encounter narrowed the period in which Melodee's disappearance must have occurred. Law enforcement did not publicly release the exact date or time of the vehicle return, but confirmed that it occurred after October 9th. Investigators described a return as routine in appearance, with no immediate alarm raised by rental staff at the time. Authorities noted that rental agencies are not tasked with monitoring passenger composition beyond contractual obligations, and therefore the absence of a child did not prompt an automatic report. As the investigation advanced, officials examined whether any contemporaneous explanation was provided for Melodee's absence. According to public reporting, no documentation from the rental transaction reflected a stated reason for the child not being present. Investigators indicated that this lack of explanation became relevant only after the child was formally reported missing. Authorities also evaluated whether the vehicle return aligned with other known movements by Ashlee Buzzard. Law enforcement stated that the return occurred after the period in which Melodee was last believed to have been alive. This sequencing placed the return within a critical interval that investigators sought to analyze in detail, particularly in relation to travel routes and subsequent actions. Investigators emphasized that the act of returning the vehicle without a child was not, in isolation, determinative of wrongdoing. Officials cautioned that conclusions must be based on the totality of evidence rather than a single event. However, they acknowledged that the return marked a transition from joint travel to solitary movement, which required reconciliation with earlier representations of the trip. The return without Melodee also prompted investigators to reassess statements and assumptions made during the early stages of the missing child inquiry. Authorities noted that once the disappearance report was filed, the vehicle return assumed increased significance as one of the last verifiable actions involving Ashlee Buzzard before law enforcement intervention intensified. Investigators further stated that the return of the rental vehicle preceded Ashlee Buzzard's reappearance in California. This sequence contributed to the broader reconstruction of events, as it established that Melodee did not accompany her mother back to family's home. Law enforcement emphasized that this fact was not disputed and formed part of the undisputed timeline. Officials reiterated that the evidentiary value of the vehicle return lay in its timing rather than its appearance. There were no publicly reported indications of damage, irregular mileage disclosures, or anomalies at the point of return that were disclosed at this stage. Investigators stated that any such findings would be addressed through formal proceedings if relevant. By the conclusion of this phase, the return without a child had become one of the most consequential chronological anchors in the case. It did not explain what occurred to Melodee Buzzard, but it established when she was definitively no longer present. Authorities stated that this moment framed subsequent investigative questions and underscored the narrowing window in which critical events must have taken place, a window that would later intersect with forensic findings still under evaluation. As the missing child investigation expanded following the disappearance report and the reconstruction of the road trip timeline, law enforcement began documenting concerns related to early cooperation from Ashlee Buzzard. According to public reporting and official statements, investigators encountered limitations in obtaining timely and complete information during initial efforts to locate Melodee Buzzard. Authorities did not publicly characterize these issues as obstruction, but acknowledged that cooperation levels became an area of note as the inquiry progressed. Law enforcement stated that cooperation assessments are standard in missing child cases, particularly when a legal guardian is the primary source of information regarding recent movements. In this case, investigators indicated that early interactions did not immediately resolve key factual questions, including Melodee's precise whereabouts following the October 7th departure from California. Officials emphasized that incomplete or delayed information can complicate efforts to rapidly verify a child's safety. Investigators did not release transcripts or detailed summaries of early communications, citing investigative sensitivity. However, law enforcement acknowledged that responses received during this period did not conclusively establish Melodee's location or condition. As a result, authorities continue to pursue independent verification through records, surveillance, and third-party documentation rather than relying solely on parental accounts. The issue of cooperation gained additional relevance as the investigation shifted from a welfare inquiry to a missing child case. Law enforcement noted that when a child cannot be located through routine verification, investigative standards require broader scrutiny of all available information sources. Officials stated that cooperation is evaluated not only in terms of willingness to communicate, but also in consistency and verifiability of information provided. As the inquiry intensified, authorities documented that Ashlee Buzzard did not consistently engage with investigators during certain phases of the search. Public reporting referenced law enforcement descriptions of her as uncooperative at points, though officials clarified that such characterizations reflect investigative challenges rather than formal legal findings. Investigators emphasized that a lack of cooperation does not, by itself, establish culpability. The cooperation concerns were later contextualized by a separate legal incident that occurred during the search period. In November, Ashlee Buzzard was charged with false imprisonment after allegedly preventing a man from leaving her home. Law enforcement stated that the individual had been attempting to assist in efforts to locate Melodee. Authorities noted that the charge was ultimately dismissed and stressed that it was legally distinct from the death investigation. Investigators clarified that the dismissal of the false imprisonment charge did not negate the relevance of the incident to the broader investigative record. While the matter did not result in a conviction, it was documented as part of the sequence of events occurring during the search for the missing child. Law enforcement emphasized that such incidents are evaluated for context rather than outcome when reconstructing investigative timelines. As authorities reviewed early cooperation concerns, they also acknowledged the procedural limitations inherent in public-facing disclosures. Officials stated that investigative decisions are guided by cumulative assessments rather than isolated interactions. Cooperation issues were considered alongside travel record, surveillance footage, and subsequent forensic findings. By the end of this phase, law enforcement had formally noted that early cooperation concerns existed, but had not publicly attributed definitive significance to them. Investigators emphasized that the case continued to develop through corroborated evidence rather than assumptions drawn from cooperation levels alone. While these concerns informed investigative focus, authorities maintained that ultimate conclusions would depend on verifiable facts, scientific analysis, and judicial review rather than preliminary characterizations made during the search phase. During the period in which investigators were attempting to locate Melodee Buzzard, the primary investigation was temporarily complicated by a separate legal matter involving her mother, Ashlee Buzzard. According to public reporting, this ancillary case emerged in November, weeks after the disappearance report and while the search for the missing child remained unresolved. Law enforcement confirmed that Ashlee Buzzard was arrested and charged with false imprisonment following an incident unrelated to the original missing child inquiry. Authorities stated that the charge arose after a man who had been assisting in efforts to locate Melodee Buzzard alleged that he was prevented from leaving Ashlee Buzzard's residence. Law enforcement documentation described the incident as a discrete event, legally distinct from the disappearance investigation. Officials emphasized that the charge was based on the specific circumstances of that encounter and not on any determination related to Melodee's whereabouts. The filing of the false imprisonment charge introduced a parallel legal process that briefly shifted public and investigative attention. Law enforcement acknowledged that the arrest generated media coverage independent of the missing child case, creating the appearance of momentum in one area, while the primary investigation remained constrained by limited information. Investigators noted that such developments can complicate case management by diverting resources and public focus. Officials clarified that the false imprisonment case did not result in sustained legal action. According to public records, the charge was later dismissed, and Ashlee Buzzard was released. Law enforcement stated that the dismissal reflected prosecutorial determinations specific to that incident and did not constitute an exoneration or finding related to the disappearance or death investigation involving Melodee Buzzard. Investigators further emphasized that the side case did not alter the evidentiary requirements of the missing child inquiry. While the incident was documented as part of the overall timeline, authorities stated that it neither advanced nor resolved questions regarding Melodee's location. Law enforcement reiterated that each case must be evaluated on its own merits, using standards appropriate to the alleged conduct. At approximately this stage of the investigation, officials acknowledged that the side case created procedural noise. While the missing child investigation required careful reconstruction of travel, surveillance, and forensic data, the separate charge introduced an additional legal narrative that risked conflating unrelated issues. Investigators stated that internal case management processes were used to maintain separation between the two matters. Authorities also addressed public perception concerns arising from the side case. Law enforcement noted that arrests in ancillary matters can create assumptions regarding broader culpability, which may not be supported by evidence. Officials reiterated that legal standards require each allegation to be independently substantiated and cautioned against drawing conclusions based on proximity rather than proof. The dismissal of the false imprisonment charge did not conclude investigative scrutiny. Law enforcement stated that while the side case was closed, the circumstances surrounding it were preserved in records as part of the overall sequence of events. Investigators emphasized that contextual incidents occurring during an active search are often reviewed for relevance, even when they do not result in convictions. By the conclusion of this phase, the side case was no longer an active legal proceeding, but its brief prominence underscored the fragmented nature of the investigation during that period. Authorities maintained that the disappearance and subsequent death investigation required renewed focus on verifiable evidence rather than peripheral legal developments. The resolution of the ancillary charge allowed investigators to recenter efforts on the primary inquiry, which continued to await forensic confirmation and the consolidation of cross-jurisdictional findings. The investigation entered a materially different phase when law enforcement confirmed that human remains had been recovered in Utah in early December. According to public reporting and official statements, the remains were located in an area that investigators later stated had been traveled through by Melodee Buzzard and her mother during the October road trip. Authorities emphasized that the discovery itself preceded formal identification by several weeks, as forensic confirmation was required before any attribution could be made. Law enforcement stated that the location of the remains was not randomly selected during the search process. Investigators indicated that the area had been identified through an analysis of travel routes, reconstructed movements, and information developed during the missing child investigation. Officials did not publicly disclose a precise discovery site, citing the need to preserve investigative integrity and protect evidentiary details pending further proceedings. At the time the remains were found, authorities refrained from making any public announcement regarding identity. Investigators stated that the condition of the remains required careful forensic handling and laboratory analysis. According to law enforcement sources, investigators were awaiting DNA testing results to determine whether the remains could be conclusively linked to Melodee Buzzard. Officials emphasized that premature identification without scientific confirmation would have been inconsistent with investigative standards. As the weeks progressed, law enforcement acknowledged publicly that they were waiting on DNA results. Investigators explained that the delay reflected the complexity of forensic testing, particularly when remains are exposed to environmental factors that may degrade biological material. Authorities did not specify whether the samples initially yielded full genetic profiles or partial markers, noting only that confirmation required laboratory verification. During this period, investigators assessed the broader implications of the Utah discovery. Law enforcement sources stated that, based on investigative timelines, they believe Melodee Buzzard had likely been deceased since October. Officials characterized this assessment as an investigative conclusion derived from the chronology of events rather than a finalized forensic determination. Authorities cautioned that precise dating of death would depend on additional scientific analysis. The Utah recovery site assumed increased significance once DNA results were returned. According to public reporting, the laboratory analysis confirmed that the remains were those of Melodee Buzzard. Law enforcement stated that the confirmation resolved the question of identity, while simultaneously reframing the investigation as a homicide inquiry. Officials emphasized that identification alone did not establish cause or manner of death. Investigators noted that the geographic connection between the Utah site and the documented road trip route formed part of the evidentiary rationale for focusing on that area. Law enforcement stated that this overlap strengthened the investigative linkage between the disappearance timeline and the recovery location, though they cautioned that correlation does not equate to proof of specific actions or intent. At approximately this stage, authorities reiterated that many forensic questions remained unanswered. Law enforcement did not publicly disclose whether trauma could be identified from the remains or whether environmental exposure limited such determinations. Officials stated that additional testing and expert review were ongoing and that results would be addressed through formal channels rather than media briefings. Public reporting reflected that investigators believed the child had been killed based on the totality of the circumstances. Authorities described this belief as an investigative assessment rather than a finalized forensic ruling. Officials reiterated that the belief was informed by the disappearance context, the recovery remains, and the absence of evidence supporting accidental or natural death scenarios, while acknowledging that such distinctions require formal substantiation. As these assessments were communicated, law enforcement also highlighted the limitations inherent in the available evidence. Investigators noted that some forensic questions might remain unresolved even after full analysis is completed. They stated that in cases involving delayed recovery, forensic services may be unable to conclusively determine certain aspects, including exact cause or precise timing. Such limitations, officials emphasized, will be documented transparently within official reports. By the end of this phase, the investigation occupied a position between inference and confirmation. While authorities had suggested a likely period and manner consistent with homicide, definitive scientific conclusions had not been publicly finalized. Investigators maintained that further results were pending and that any formal declarations will be made through appropriate legal channels. Until then, the cause and timing of Melodee Buzzard's death remained suggested rather than conclusively established, reflecting the careful balance between investigative assessment and scientific certainty. With the progression of forensic review and consolidation of investigative findings, law enforcement began to publicly contextualize the arrest of Ashlee Buzzard within a broader evidentiary framework. Authorities emphasized that the arrest, initially reported following DNA confirmation of the remains, was not a reactionary measure, but the result of cumulative analysis. Officials stated that the enforcement action reflected a reframing of the case from a missing child investigation into a criminal matter requiring prosecutorial evaluation. Investigators clarified that the arrest should be understood as a procedural step informed by multiple converging factors. These included the reconstructed travel timeline, the absence of verified sightings after October 9th, the return of the rental vehicle without Melodee present, and the recovery of remains along the documented route of travel. Law enforcement stated that no single element was determinative. Rather, the arrest reflected the aggregate weight of evidence developed over time. Authorities were careful to distinguish between arrest and adjudication. Officials reiterated that an arrest establishes probable cause, not guilt, and that the evidentiary threshold for prosecution differs from that required for conviction. Law enforcement emphasized that judicial proceedings will provide the forum for testing evidence, assessing credibility, and determining legal responsibility. As the arrest was reframed, investigators also addressed public assumptions regarding motive and mechanism. Law enforcement stated that while the case had advanced significantly, critical forensic determinations remained pending. Officials noted that the arrest did not depend on finalized cause of death findings, but rather on the alignment of investigative facts sufficient to justify enforcement under applicable legal standards. The reframing also involved clarification of the role played by earlier investigative challenges. Authorities acknowledged that delays in forensic confirmation and cross-jurisdictional coordination affected the timing of enforcement action. Investigators emphasized that such delays reflected procedural necessity rather than investigative hesitation, particularly in cases involving recovery of remains outside the originating jurisdiction. Law enforcement further stated that the arrest did not close the investigative record. Officials indicated that additional evidence review, forensic analysis, and witness evaluation would continue following the arrest. Authorities emphasized that arrests can occur while investigations remain active, especially when scientific findings are still being finalized. At approximately this stage, investigators addressed the question of why the arrest occurred when it did. Law enforcement stated that DNA confirmation served as a critical threshold event, allowing investigators to formally link the recovered remains to the missing child case. Once that linkage was established, authorities indicated that the legal posture of the case shifted, enabling enforcement action consistent with prosecutorial standards. The reframing of the arrest also underscored the distinction between public narrative and investigative process. Law enforcement noted that public understanding often focuses on singular events, while investigations rely on cumulative assessment. Officials emphasized that the arrest should be viewed within the context of months of investigative work, rather than as an isolated development. By the conclusion of this phase, the arrest had been positioned not as an endpoint, but as a procedural transition. Authorities maintained that while enforcement action marked a significant development, it did not resolve all factual questions. Investigators reiterated that the evidentiary record remained under development, and that final determinations would depend on scientific results, judicial proceedings, and standards of proof yet to be applied. By the close of the current investigative phase, the case involving the death of Melodee Buzzard had progressed substantially from its origin as a missing child report, yet remained defined by unresolved evidentiary limitations. The identification of remains recovered in Utah and the subsequent arrest of Ashlee Buzzard established a procedural framework for criminal adjudication, but did not provide comprehensive answers regarding the circumstances of the child's death. Authorities consistently emphasized that while investigative probabilities suggested a homicide occurring during the October travel period, definitive scientific conclusions had not been publicly finalized. Law enforcement acknowledged that key forensic questions remained subject to laboratory analysis and expert review. Officials cautioned that environmental exposure and the condition of the remains could limit the ability to determine precise cause or timing of death. As a result, aspects of the case continued to rest on reconstructed timelines and corroborated movements rather than conclusive physical evidence. Investigators further noted that the arrest represented a threshold determination rather than a final resolution. Judicial proceedings would be required to test the evidentiary record and assess legal responsibility under established standards of proof. Until those processes are completed, conclusions regarding culpability remain allegations rather than findings. In this posture, the case stands as formally advanced yet substantially incomplete. While identity has been confirmed and enforcement action taken, the absence of definitive forensic conclusions leaves critical questions unanswered. Without physical evidence capable of conclusively resolving cause and timing, the full account of what occurred remains unresolved and likely to remain subject to continued examination rather than immediate closure. The discovery of remains in Utah represented the most consequential factual development in the case. While the confirmation established Melodee Buzzard's death and ended the search for her whereabouts, it did not provide comprehensive answers regarding how or when she died. Investigators emphasized that the recovery marked a transition point rather than a conclusion, with a full evidentiary picture still dependent on pending forensic findings and continued investigative analysis. Following the confirmation that the remains recovered in Utah belonged to Melodee Buzzard, investigators entered a period defined by scientific review rather than immediate disclosure. Law enforcement stated that while DNA testing had resolved the question of identity, multiple forensic determinations remained outstanding. Officials emphasized that conclusions regarding cause of death, manner of death, and precise timing required additional laboratory analysis and expert interpretation beyond initial identification procedures. Authorities acknowledged that the condition of the remains presented inherent limitations. According to public reporting, the remains have been exposed to environmental factors for an extended period, a circumstance that can complicate forensic assessment. Investigators caution that such exposure may result in degraded samples, incomplete biological material, or contamination risks that restrict the scope of reliable conclusions. As a result, officials declined to provide early estimates or speculative assessments while scientific work was ongoing. At approximately this stage, law enforcement clarified the distinction between DNA identification and broader forensic analysis. While DNA testing can confirm identity with high confidence, it does not by itself establish how or when death occurred. Investigators stated that additional examinations were required to evaluate skeletal indicators, potential trauma, and any remaining soft tissue evidence. Officials noted that not all deaths yield conclusive forensic signatures, particularly when remains are recovered after significant time has passed. Public statements from law enforcement reflected careful, qualified language. Authorities indicated that investigators were awaiting results from forensic services before making determinations regarding cause or timing. Officials used terms such as pending, under review, and not yet determined when addressing questions related to science. They emphasized that premature conclusions could misrepresent the evidentiary record and compromise subsequent legal proceedings. During this waiting period, investigators also reviewed whether supplemental forensic methods could assist in narrowing the timeline. Law enforcement did not publicly confirm the use of entomological analysis, soil comparison, or other specialized techniques, stating only that appropriate methods will be considered based on the condition of the remains. Officials reiterated that any scientific findings would need to meet evidentiary thresholds suitable for judicial scrutiny. The absence of immediate forensic conclusions also shaped the pacing of enforcement decisions. Authorities stated that while the arrest of Ashlee Buzzard followed DNA confirmation, further prosecutorial steps would depend on the accumulation of admissible evidence. Investigators emphasized that scientific findings often play a central role in determining the scope and framing of charges, particularly in cases involving delayed recovery of remains. Law enforcement addressed expectations regarding timelines. Officials noted that forensic analysis can take weeks or months, depending on complexity and laboratory capacity. Authorities cautioned that delays should not be interpreted as inactivity, but rather as part of a methodical process required to ensure accuracy. Investigators further acknowledged that some questions might remain unresolved even after scientific review is completed. They stated that in cases involving environmental exposure and delayed recovery, forensic services may be unable to conclusively determine certain aspects, including precise time of death or specific mechanisms of injury. Such limitations, officials emphasized, are documented transparently within forensic reports. By the conclusion of this phase, the investigation remained in a holding pattern defined by scientific uncertainty. While identity had been established and enforcement action taken, the central factual questions depended on forensic results not yet finalized. Authorities stated that until the science was complete, definitive conclusions would remain provisional, with the evidentiary record continuing to develop through careful, incremental review rather than immediate declaration. As forensic review progressed beyond identification, law enforcement began to outline provisional assessments regarding the likely cause and timing of Melodee Buzzard's death. Authorities emphasized that these assessments were investigative in nature and not final scientific determinations. Public reporting indicated that investigators believed the child had likely been deceased since October, a conclusion derived from the reconstructed timeline rather than from completed forensic dating. Officials were careful to distinguish between investigative inference and laboratory-confirmed findings. Law enforcement stated that the suggested timing aligned with the sequence of documented events established earlier in the case. The departure from California on October 7th, the last believed sighting near the Colorado-Utah border on October 9th, and the subsequent return of the rental vehicle without the child formed the chronological framework supporting this assessment. Investigators clarified that the absence of verified sightings or records involving Melodee after October 9th contributed to conclusion that death likely occurred within that narrowed window. Authorities cautioned that precise determination of time of death can be difficult when remains are recovered after prolonged environmental exposure. According to official statements, the condition of the remains limited the ability of forensic experts to apply certain methodologies with confidence. Investigators acknowledge that decomposition, weather conditions, and environmental factors can affect the reliability of post-mortem interval estimates. As a result, officials avoid assigning a specific date or time and instead reference a broader period consistent with known movements. With respect to cause of death, law enforcement did not publicly disclose a definitive finding. Investigators stated that forensic analysis was ongoing and that not all cases yield conclusive results, particularly when remains are incomplete or degraded. Officials use cautious language, noting that certain indicators may be inconclusive or unavailable for assessment. No public statement confirmed whether trauma could be uniquely identified or whether any injuries could be definitively attributed to a specific mechanism. During this phase, investigators addressed the distinction between suggested cause and legally established cause. Law enforcement emphasized that any conclusions presented publicly were preliminary and subject to revision based on further scientific analysis. Officials stated that determinations regarding cause of death must meet evidentiary standards appropriate for court proceedings, and that speculative or incomplete findings would not be advanced as definitive conclusions.